Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me.
Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great? Good. Today, in the latest episode of the A Short and Convoluted History series, we're going to take a look at America's U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1903, or M1903 Springfield as most of us know it. Now, as always, these episodes are meant to be a brief introduction to the subject matter, not an exhaustive exploration. Before we get into the history of the rifle, let's take a closer look at our subject.
Poor Johnny's heart went pity-pity-pat somewhere in sunny France.
Let's start with the numbers. The rifle is a handy 43.2 inches or 1.1 meters long. The barrel comes in at 24 inches or 61 centimeters in length. Finally, she weighs 8.7 pounds or 3.9 kilograms. The rifle is chambered in God's preferred round, the 30-06 cartridge. Working from back to front. At the unfriendly end, we have a blade post front sight. Below and behind that is the bayonet attachment point and the front sling swivel. Speaking of bayonets, unfortunately, this is one of those rare rifles in my collection that I don't own a bayonet for, so you'll have to make do with pictures. What you're seeing now is the original integral rod or spike bayonet. If you've never seen one before, I'm not surprised. There are reportedly only 100 original rifles that still have this bayonet. Next up is the model 1905 bayonet that replaced it at the insistence of no less than a United States president. More on that later. Next up is our rear sight, something that looks like and perhaps should only be on a competition rifle at Camp Perry. It is a flip-up sight, originally designed by, and I'm not making this name up, Adelbert R. Buffington of the United States Army Ordnance Department, a former superintendent at Springfield Armory, and someone who we will be meeting again in this video. It's graduated to 2,700 yards, and it can be adjusted with this knob for windage. When the leaf and the slider are down, you have a battle notch sight, which is set for 547 yards. A later version of the Springfield rifle introduced a ramp-type rear aperture sight adjustable for both elevation and windage. That one has a sane 100 to 800 yard graduation. Continuing on backwards, we have an internal magazine which holds 5 rounds and was intended to be fed with stripper clips. Flipping back over to the top and just behind the rear sights, we see the markings that pretty much all M1903s featured. You've got your armory that built it, in this case, the U.S. Springfield Armory, the model of the rifle, a model 1903, and in this case, a sub-variant, Mark I, and I'll explain that later, and the serial number of the rifle. If you didn't know that the M1893 Spanish Mauser partly inspired the M1903, well, here's a big tell. One genuine Mauser-style flag safety. Behind that, you got yourself a manual cocking piece, and along the left side of the receiver, you have a magazine cutoff. Finally, over there on the other side, one bent bolt handle. This particular rifle has something a little extra, as this is an M1903 Springfield Mark I rifle, as you saw on the receiver markings earlier. It has an ejection port on the left side of the receiver, just ahead of the magazine cutoff. The Mark I version of the rifle was intended for use with the Pedersen Device, an experimental attachment which turned the rifle into a semi-automatic. I'm not going to get into the Pedersen at this point in the video, but if you do find a rifle with this port, you know that it's a Mark I. Finally, in back, we have a rear sling swivel, a metal buttstock with a convenient spot for a cleaning kit.
We come from every quarter, from the north, south, east, and west.
If American small arms procurement in the 20th century was often characterized as sometimes messy, prior to that it could be an absolute clown show. Fitting for a country that was uncomfortable, at least back then, with the idea of a large standing army, rifles were often, perhaps not surprisingly, not exactly a high priority budget item for Congress. And that often led to a hodgepodge of small arms that were hurriedly bought on an urgently needed basis. The Civil War alone could probably generate a Ken Burns-length documentary on the topic of small arms procurement. And the late 1800s weren't that much different. Incensed, and perhaps incited, by the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. Now, I'm not going to get into the war, as it's a complicated topic, but America essentially won it after a few months of fighting. But while the exercise of the Monroe Doctrine was successful, the arms of the United States were viewed less so. The country's soldiers were sent in with the relatively new Springfield Krag-Jorgensen rifle adopted in 1892, and also making the trip were single-shot Model 1873 Springfield trapdoor rifles. How much of what I'm about to relate to you is grounded in reality and how much was the result of sensationalized reporting is up for debate these days. The Spanish soldiers that the Americans were facing entered battle with the Spanish Mauser, or Mauser Model 1893 if you want to be proper. If you've watched any of my episodes on Mauser rifles from this period, it probably won't surprise you to learn that these were damned fine rifles and easily superior to the Krag and obviously the trapdoor. The Americans learned this firsthand on July 1st, 1898, when a small Spanish force of about 500 soldiers in El Caney held off nearly 8,000 U.S. and independent soldiers for about 10 hours. A few hours later at Santiago, 750 Spanish regulars holding positions at San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill absolutely mauled a force of 6,600 Americans, inflicting 1,400 casualties in mere minutes and delaying the Yanks' advance. This despite the fact that the American attack was supported by Gatling guns and artillery. Although both American attacks were ultimately successful, the nature of the outcomes concerned many in Army brass. The United States launched a board of investigation which came to the conclusion that the superior firepower of the Spanish Mausers was responsible for America's bloody victory and recommended replacement of the Krags. Although I said I won't go into the war, I will report that experts have argued that while the Mausers were in fact superior in almost every way to the Krags, perhaps just as important to the drubbing and victory that the Americans experienced was due to excellent Spanish defensive positions. So the Krag might have suffered a bit of an unfair judgment, in my opinion. That said, the Army believed that a new rifle was needed.
Goodbye, Broadway, hello, France.
Well, here's a first for this series. There was no designer. A champion, perhaps, but not an identifiable face that I can show you in a grainy black and white photograph. We don't have a great man like Mauser or Garand or Tokarev who gifted us with a nearly complete design. The M1903 was largely the result of work by a number of talented engineers at Springfield Armory. Now, the process was driven and shepherded by the aforementioned Adelbert Buffington, who at the time was the chief of ordnance. But he didn't design the M1903, though he apparently was actually a talented designer. And as we'll see later, he seemed more interested in saving the Krag Jorgensen initially than necessarily introducing a whole new rifle. At any rate, after the Americans won the Spanish-American War, Spain surrendered several colonies to the United States, and rifles, a lot of rifles. Flooding back to the United States were thousands of Spanish Mausers, and some of them ended up at Springfield, where eager engineers, machinists, and designers got a close look at them. And they acknowledged that the M1893 was indeed a fine rifle. But this wasn't going to be a straight copy job. As we'll see, Springfield and Buffington wanted the best of a few worlds, and that meant attempting to squeeze together a few different rifles into a harmonious result.
Little girl, don't cry, I must say goodbye. Don't you...
The move to a new rifle didn't come without roadblocks. Buffington and Springfield Armory did their damnedest to try and save the Krag Jorgensen. Throughout much of 1899, Buffington attempted to upgrade the Krag to accept more powerful ammunition, one of the criticisms that had been levied against it. That involved Springfield beefing up the chamber to handle up to 40,000 psi and adding a second lug in order to prevent said chamber from blowing up. Buffington, through Springfield's efforts, actually succeeded, but then he was given another requirement. A newly instituted rifle board told him that any new rifle in service needed the capability to be loaded with clips. Why, just like a Mauser. Remarkably, that feat was managed as well. An ordnance report at the time noted that this weird hybrid that had been born would come to be known as the Model 1901 and embodies features of both the Mauser and the United States magazine rifle, aka the Krag. The board of officers that had been charged with vetting whatever Springfield managed to come up with finally received this prototype rifle. It was heavily based on the Krag and the Mauser M92 prototype that the American military had trialed in 1892, and were off to the races. Well, sort of. The War Department authorized Springfield Army to retool their machinery from Krag production to this new M1901 rifle, and requested $5,000 to start trials. The race, however, ended a little bit early, because instead of getting money for $5,000, they got the princely sum of $1,700 to build 100 rifles. And obviously, instead of a wide-scale testing by soldiers, it was rather officers and selected Army cavalry soldiers that would field test the M1901. They were provided rifles with 3 different barrel lengths to test: 24, 26, and 30 inches. In news that will surprise no one, at least if you haven't carried a rifle, the soldiers really liked the 24-inch barreled versions. And what sealed the deal was an assurance by Frankfurt Arsenal that ammunition could be produced that would hit 2,300 feet per second out of these short barrels. Now, as a result of the field testing, a final version of the M1901 was the result, one with that 24-inch barrel and a couple of other minor changes that the trials had suggested. The following year, the rifle board were provided with an updated prototype of the 1901, informed by the trials, and it was shockingly dubbed the Model 1902. Meeting in 1903, the rifle board decreed that this rifle was worthy of replacing the Krag Jorgensen, thanks to its accuracy and rapidity of fire, a judgment, no doubt, that was heavily informed by the experiences of some of the board members who had still fresh in the mind memories of battles with American Indians. On June 20th, 1903, the Model 1902, after passing all of its tests, including those demanded by United States President Theodore Roosevelt himself, who had a bug up his rump about accuracy, Secretary of War Elihu Root approved for adoption this rifle, one that would be dubbed the U.S. Magazine Rifle, model of 1903, caliber of .30. I've glossed over the role that Roosevelt played in the story of the M1903 only because it's so involved. He injected himself into the process to the point that a later historian dubbed the M1903 as Roosevelt's rifle. Although I've mentioned Buffington a few times, Roosevelt and Root ultimately took over in determining the direction of the American military, what weapons they would employ, and what the M1903 ultimately ended up being. Just as an example, the M1903 was originally issued with a spike bayonet, something that greatly offended Roosevelt. In January 1905, after 80,000 of the rifles had already been produced with the mount to accept that bayonet, he wrote a letter to Secretary of War William Howard Taft, which stated, "I must say that I think that ramrod bayonet is about as poor an invention as I ever saw. As you observed, it broke short off as soon as hit with even moderate violence. It would have no moral effect and mighty little physical effect." And so those 80,000 rifles had to be retooled to accept the new bladed bayonet, one to be known as the model of 1905 bayonet. Believe me, Roosevelt's story with the rifle runs deeper, and perhaps the subject of its own video one day. At any rate, this new rifle combined features that were present in both the Krag and Mauser. Those aspects included the Krag's cock-on opening bolt, magazine cutoff, and its stock and sights, along with the Mauser's dual locking lugs, external claw extractor, stripper clip feeding, and staggered column magazine. Springfield Armory immediately leapt into action and began churning out rifles furiously, about 200 per 8-hour day. To kick off production, the Armory built a second set of tooling that would instead be installed at Rock Island Arsenal, which began production of M1903s in May 1904. Perhaps slowing things down a little bit at first was the fact that Springfield was still producing Krag Jorgensens. From November 1903, when M1903 production began, to January 1904, when the last of the Krags were built, both rifles were in simultaneous production. Now, contrary to what many believe, the rifle saw its first combat in 1903 and 1904, not the First World War. American soldiers first employed them during the Philippine-US War and Moro Rebellion, and they also saw some use in the expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916. Production was halted in January 1905 so that two changes could be made: the aforementioned Model 1905 bayonet and new rear sights, known as the Model 1905 rear sights, both of which were integrated into the design. Okay, clear sailing going forward now, right? Until November 1906, thanks to the introduction of a new cartridge. The original M1903 round, known as the 30-03, featured a 220 grain round nose bullet, whereas the new M1906 cartridge, you've probably heard of the 30-06, had a 150 grain Spitzer bullet that blazed downrange at 2,700 feet per second. The new M1906 cartridge, however, also had another difference that necessitated a change to the rifle as well. The new cartridge's neck was slightly shorter than the old one, 0.07 inches to be precise, and that meant that the rifle's chamber needed to be modified. So production of the rifle was halted from that November through to February 1907 so that 200,000 M1903 rifles could be rechambered. By November 1913, a total of 800,000 rifles had been manufactured, and it was decided to wind down Rock Island production. From then on, production of the M1903 moved at a fairly leisurely pace. Now, of course, if you know your world history, you are undoubtedly aware that about that time, Europe was less wondering if a war was going to take place, but when. The race to war essentially kicked off on June 28, 1914, when Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. 1 month later, on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the world was quickly plunged into its first taste of industrialized warfare. Well, except for the United States, still living off the fumes of their preferred policy of isolationism, America didn't enter the war until April 1917, and that allowed production of the M1903 to continue, still leisurely, although production at Rock Island had resumed in February of that year. By the end of World War I, a total of 1.1 million rifles had been produced. Now that might have been plenty during peacetime, but about 4 million Americans had served in the Army during the First World War. That meant that more rifles had been needed by doughboys, and those rifles proved to be the M1917 Enfield rifle. A total of 2.1 million of those were produced by Winchester, Remington, and Eddystone, which means that more than half of the rifles carried by doughboys were in fact the M1917, not the M1903. For example, war hero Sergeant Alvin York actually carried an M1917. Although it wasn't the most used rifle, it did garner a reputation as a reliable and well-built one. Assistant Secretary of War Benedict Crowell stated in a 1919 book, "America, since the days of Daniel Boone, a nation of cracked shots, was naturally the home of good rifles. Hence, perhaps it is not surprising that the United States should be the nation to produce the closest shooting military rifle known in its day. This was the United States rifle, model of 1903, popularly known as the Springfield." More important, perhaps, was the opinion of grunts, and they praised the rifle's accuracy and near mystical ability to keep running even in the dirtiest and muddiest conditions. Now, some did take issue with the rear sight, arguing that it sat just a bit too far away from the shooter's eye, and not to mention that it was fairly delicate for something that you'd find on a military rifle, something that I actually completely agree with. Although the Great War was over, the rifle service wasn't. In the 1920s and 30s, the U.S. supplied the rifles to its allies in several countries, which included Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Cuba, and probably the last time that American weapons would make their way to those countries in the 20th century. Incidentally, some of the M1903s were used by the Cuban government during the Bay of Pigs invasion. In between the two world wars, American soldiers did carry them in what today we would probably call police actions in places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But by the 1930s, the U.S. military decided that it was time for a change. In 1936, the United States military adopted the M1 Garand as its standard service rifle, but the M1903 wasn't actually going anywhere. Production on the M1903 had been suspended in 1935 with a total of nearly 1.5 million produced, with the anticipation that the Garand would be taking over. Well, as history tells us, production on the Garand was slower than anticipated, at least in part due to Great Depression-related spending constraints. So on March 1937, production once again resumed on the cheaper to manufacture M1903. Then it stopped again in October 1939. But then it started again in 1940 before stopping again. If you're getting the idea that production of the rifle tended to go in fits, well, it's largely the truth. However, in 1941, it was becoming clear that America wasn't going to stay out of the Second World War much longer, and perhaps with that in mind, production of the M1903 ramped up again that year. Several private companies were added to the manufacturing fold, including Remington, who used the old Rock Island tooling that had been sitting in storage since the end of the First World War. And old, by the way, was an appropriate word. That tooling had seen extensive use by Rock Island, and it had begun to wear out for Remington. So they went to the military and asked for a number of changes to the manufacturing process, which ended up seeing several parts going from milled to stamped steel. In 1942, typewriter company Smith Corona also began to manufacture the rifle. It's commonly believed that the M1903 primarily saw use in the Pacific, but the rifle was actually seen in use by American soldiers and Marines across all theaters. Now, I think the mistaken perception is largely due to the fact that the Marines were armed with Springfields in the early part of the Pacific campaign, such as Guadalcanal. Another myth is that Springfields functioned better in the Pacific than the M1 Garand, something very few Marines would have actually agreed with. In one area that the Springfield was superior, though, was rifle grenades. The M1 Garand initially didn't have the capability to fire them, whereas the M1903 did. So one soldier in each squad often carried an M1903 slung across his back for just that purpose. By early 1944, most American troops were carrying the M1 Garand. Now, while there were some units that continued to carry the Springfield until the end of the war, such as Army Rangers in certain situations, Garand's rifle was pretty much the main game for soldiers. That wasn't the end for the Springfield, of course. The M1903A4, the sniper variant of the rifle, saw use all the way into the Korean War. Although the US Army began to replace it at that point, the Marine Corps stuck with it. They found that their M1C and M1D rifles were effective out to about 500 yards, but if they needed to go further, the A4 was the only choice, and reportedly several 1,000-yard kills were notched with it and the issued Untitled 7.8 power scope. Post-Korea, at least for America, the Springfield was largely retired from service. The United States Navy did have M1903A3s on board some ships to destroy mines, and there was some use of the A4 sniper rifle in Vietnam. That's really about it. By the 1970s, the Springfield's primary use in the American military was that of a drill rifle, and still in use at several institutions, including the Citadel. Ultimately, a total of 3 million rifles were produced between 1903 and 1949. I won't go too deep into the topic of low serial number M1903s and the issues that many of them faced, as I made an entire video about this back in May 2021. That said, I will go over it briefly in case you haven't seen that video, so at least you have an idea as to what the issue was. In 1917, the United States military learned that there might be a problem with the M1903. It seemed that occasionally the rifle's receivers would have the uncomfortable habit of shattering while firing. And so production was halted until General Julian Hatcher could determine why that was happening. Now, what he found was that employees at both Springfield and Rock Island who were responsible for heat treating receivers were using the eyeball method to determine what temperature they were reaching. Heat treating is used to harden steel. If you heat treat at too high a temperature, the metal becomes brittle, too low, and it doesn't get hardened sufficiently. What Hatcher found was that the employees were using the color of the heated metal to determine its temperature. What they weren't aware of was that the ambient color of their surroundings could affect how they perceived that color. On cloudy days, they did a reasonably good job of estimating temperature, but on sunny days they could underestimate temperatures by as much as 300 degrees, causing them to then increase the heat and end up with more brittle receivers. The issue was resolved with the installation of temperature gauging equipment, but that left just over 1 million rifles that had been built at both arsenals that had inconsistently heat-treated receivers. How many receivers shattered over the decades of the rifle's use is an unknown. We are aware that several dozen soldiers were in fact injured by the late 1920s, but we don't have any hard data for afterwards. The military explored withdrawing the rifles from service, but ultimately continued to use low serial number rifles until the end of the Second World War. All that said, there has been a long-running debate in the collecting community about whether low serial number Springfields are safe to shoot. And my opinion is thus. Statistically speaking, any rifle that has a low serial number, 800,000 and below for Springfield, 285,507 and below for Rock Island, is actually probably safe to shoot. On the other hand, we're talking about rifles that are now between 108 and 122 years old. They've lived a long life, and they have an unknown quality of heat treating, and they could be hiding growing defects that you are not aware of. I say better safe than sorry. Keep the low number as a safe queen or a wall hanger. Go out and buy an M1903 that we know to be safe. Just my opinion, worth what you paid for it. As I said, I released a full deep dive on the topic, and you may want to watch that for a more complete overview. There is a link in the description.
The Yankee spirit still remains the same, just like Washington.
The topic of variants when it comes to the M1903 Springfield is simple and a little complicated at the same time. Now, there were 4 main variants of the rifle that were introduced, but within them, and this primarily concerns the original M1903, there were a number of sub-variants. So I'm going to cover those 4 main variants, but I'm going to touch only briefly upon a few of the more interesting sub-variants. Now, the first variant, if you want to call it that, was the original M1903 Springfield in 1903. As I stated previously, it was originally developed with the .30-03 cartridge and used what is referred to as the original Type S stock. Flowing from the original M1903 were a large number of sub-variants, the most famous of which was the Mark I variant that was developed for the Pedersen Device, something that I'm going to discuss in the next section of this video, so I'm not going to go too deep into it here. Another interesting sub-variant of the original rifle was the M1903 Air Service, issued in 1918, and it featured a fixed 25-round magazine and a modified stock that was issued to air crews. It was meant as a backup in case of an airplane's machine gun jamming during combat. Among the most rare sub-variants was the M1903 Bushmaster carbine that was introduced in 1940. Its primary feature was an 18-inch barrel, and there were over 4,700 produced. Unfortunately, most of the rifles were destroyed after World War II, and today are exceptionally rare. Finally, there was a sub-variant produced called the M1903 National Match, which was produced between 1921 and 1940, and intended for use at the National Match Shooting Competition. The rifles were produced for service teams, and you could also buy them through the National Rifle Association. Those are just a few of the sub-variants. There are more, and I leave it to you to explore that particular rabbit hole. The next main variant was the M1903A1, produced between 1929 and 1939. Its noticeable change from the original was a move from the original Type S stock with its straight stock to a Type C stock, which had a pistol grip style stock. You will find older rifles with the Type C stock since the military felt that it improved accuracy. The United States military considered any M1903 that had a Type C stock to be an M1903A1. So don't be surprised if you have an original rifle with this stock, but its receiver markings indicate it to be the older rifle. A lot of people wonder about the M1903A2, as you never hear about them or see them. A good reason for that, because they were never actually an issued rifle. Rather, the A2 is simply an A1 or A3 stripped down and used as a sub-caliber device with anti-tank and field guns. It was essentially just a barreled action that was inserted into those guns and allowed soldiers to train with them for relatively little money. I've read that by the end of World War II, a lot of the A2s were rebuilt into regular rifles. The next variant up is the M1903A3, produced from 1942 to 1944. The big change on this version was changing the sights from ladder style to an aperture system. Springfield also began using stamped metal parts to make production easier, and they modified the grip and stock slightly. Our last major variant was the M1903A4. It's essentially an M1903A3 modified to be a sniper rifle. Now obviously that meant the addition of a scope. The M73 or M73B1 2.5 power Weaver scope that the Army used, or the 7.8 power Untitled scope for the Marines, and a modification to the rifle stock. The iron sights were also removed. And there you are, a very brief look at the variants and many sub-variants of the M1903 Springfield.
Send the word over there.
John Douglas Pedersen is one of those figures of firearms history who is unfairly forgotten by many. No less than General Julian Hatcher, and we met him a couple of minutes ago investigating the heat treating of receivers issue, referred to him as the greatest gun designer in the world. I'll perhaps cover Pedersen's entire story in a separate video. Today we're just going to look at his largely ill-fated Pedersen device, introduced in 1918 to turn the bolt-action M1903 into a bullet-spitting dynamo. Before America entered the First World War, Pedersen had been toiling away at Remington. He had, however, an ambitious dream: to increase the firepower available to each soldier. The reality was, unless they were behind the machine gun, the only thing an American soldier had was their relatively slow bolt-action rifle. Probably realizing that the perennially penny-pinching Army wasn't going to wholesale replace a rifle that had been introduced into service just 14 years prior, Pedersen decided to work with what was available to him, the M1903 Springfield. And his solution was to convert that bolt-action rifle into a semi-automatic powerhouse. Now, he did that by modifying the rifle with a new bolt, which was capable of accepting a 40-round magazine which protruded from the rifle upwards and to the right at a roughly 45-degree angle. On the left side of the rifle was an ejection port. The changes caused the creation of a new version of the M1903 known as the M1903 Mark I. Now, if you're wondering how someone could be expected to carry a rifle with 40 rounds of 30-06 sticking out one side, well, be assured that wouldn't be a problem, as the rifle was chambered in a 30 caliber pistolish cartridge known as 3018 Auto, or 7.65 long. I called the Pedersen device a bolt, but in reality you could actually think of it as a pistol, which was inserted inside the receiver of a rifle. and it had the effect of turning the rifle into essentially a large blowback pistol. Well, at any rate, Pedersen traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1917 to show off his new invention, and everyone was quite impressed. The Ordnance Committee wasted no time and placed an order for 130,000 of the devices and 800 million rounds of ammunition. For his efforts, Pedersen was awarded the princely sum of $50,000, about $1.2 million in today's funny money, as well as 50 cents for each device made. The Army had big plans for the Pedersen device. The Allies had been planning a massive offensive in the spring of 1919, and the Pedersen device, along with the brand new Browning automatic rifle, were going to be front and center. Well, if you know your history, you know that there was no spring offensive in 1919 because the Axis powers graciously decided to collapse in the fall of 1918. Now, while the BAR did make it into combat, at least in the final weeks of the Great War, the M1903 Mark I with its Pedersen device hadn't even left the factory yet. Production on the device and the Mark I rifles didn't begin until December 1918, after the war's end. Now, thanks to cost-cutting after the war, the contract was canceled on March 1, 1919, after 65,000 devices, 1.6 million magazines, 65 million rounds, and just over 101,000 rifles converted. The idea of a semi-automatic rifle didn't end with the Pedersen device. In fact, the Army was all in on the idea. So in the late 1920s, they pursued a number of different paths and tested a number of different candidates, including the Pedersen device. Unfortunately for John Pedersen, a semi-automatic rifle developed by a Canadian-American arms developer named John Garand ended up winning that competition. I hope Garand's rifle worked out. In 1931, the United States Army declared the Pedersen device to be surplus, and almost all in storage were destroyed in a giant bonfire, although some managed to be liberated. Today, those exceedingly rare Pedersen devices and magazines fetch price tags in the $50,000 range, and the Mark I rifles carry a slight premium given that only 101,000 were produced. Some years back, C&R Arsenal dedicated an entire episode to the Pedersen device, and I suggest you watch it if you want a good deep dive on it. There is a lot I didn't mention about it in this story. There is a link to that video in the description.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war, it's a lovely war to be a soldier.
As you may remember, the M1903 incorporated some aspects of the Mauser M92 prototype and the M1893 Spanish Mauser. In fact, enough aspects that plenty of people, particularly lawyers within the United States government itself, got a little uncomfortable. In 1904, the American government wrote a polite letter to Mauser and proposed a meeting, to discuss whether there had been just, a little too much copying of Germany's homework by the engineers at Springfield, specifically the stripper clip. Well, Mauser showed up to the meeting and they were provided with said stripper clip and an example rifle, and they set to work sighting it. And after a month of examination, they declared that not only was the stripper clip an infringement, but there were 5 others involving the rifle itself. To avoid a lawsuit, the American government and Mauser negotiated a deal. Mauser would receive 75 cents for every rifle produced and 50 cents for every 1,000 stripper clips, to a maximum of $200,000, a deal reached in July 1909. Accounting for inflation, that's roughly equivalent to about $7 million today. Well, a few years later, another company got involved, but this time they filed a lawsuit. The manufacturers of the 8mm Mauser round. They alleged that the Spitzer bullet used by the 30-06 cartridge was an infringement upon their design. However, in unfortunate timing for the Germans, the lawsuit was filed days before the start of the First World War, and in 1917, when the United States entered the war, the lawsuit was tossed out of court and the patent seized. Well, if you can say anything about the Germans, they are tenacious. And in 1920, they brought the case forward again. And this time, an American court found that the patent seizure was a violation of a treaty that protected against that sort of thing. And they awarded the Germans $412,000, or about $6.5 million in today's money. I said earlier that Springfield's engineers didn't copy the M1893 Mauser. Mostly.
Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile.
The list of non-American users of the M1903 Springfield was actually a long one, but it should be noted that for most, it was in relatively limited quantities. So I'm going to go over the more interesting entries. Did you know that Nazi Germany actually made use of the M1903? True story. Rifles captured from American soldiers were pressed into service and designated the Gewehr 249A, the A referring to American. The rifles were used as is, that is to say, left in their 30-06 chambering, probably because the Germans didn't have the resource to start converting the rifles. Now, I don't know how many were used, but from the research that I've done, I can't imagine that it was too many, probably due to the difficulty of maintaining a reliable supply of ammunition and spare parts. Continuing on with the World War II service, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in Italy, which was a component of the Fifth Army, used American-supplied M1903 rifles. The Free French, in August 1943, received M1903 and M1917 rifles, some of which were later used in Indochina and Algeria. In news that probably won't surprise you, some of those rifles in Indochina eventually made their way into the hands of North Vietnamese forces. Rifles were also sent to nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek in China, and yes, once again, captured rifles were also used by Mao's Chinese communist soldiers. Finally, South Korean Marines used a total of 3,600 M1903A3 and M1903A4s during the Korean War. Other users included New Zealand, Haiti, Greece, and the United Kingdom, among several others.
We're out to get the honor. We don't want to be kings. We don't want to be.
If I was a wag, I would argue that the M1903 Springfield belatedly proved that the United States should have chosen the Mauser in 1892 when they had the chance, instead of the Craig Jorgensen. I, however, am not that wag. That said, I have to admit that I've long debated what the actual legacy of this rifle is. It was ostensibly America's service rifle in World War I, but the United States rifle caliber 30, model 1917, was in more doughboys' hands. The M1903 survived into World War II, but I don't think it's a gross exaggeration to say that's largely because America initially couldn't spool up production of M1 Garands fast enough to arm millions of soldiers overnight. And sure, the rifle saw some use during the Korean War, but it was primarily in the form of the M1941 sniper rifle, a variant of the M1903A4. And yes, there were a few of those sniper rifles used in Vietnam as well. Technically speaking, this rifle was in the hands of American servicemen for over 6 decades. But realistically, the rifle's true service life ended decades prior to Vietnam. So is the M1903 Springfield a rifle that receives more adoration than it actually deserves? I think this is a case where circumstances deserve more blame than the rifle, assuming there is any blame to actually assign. The reality, at least to me, is that the M1903 is one of the finest bolt-action service rifles ever produced. I think it outclasses most of its near-peer competitors, which includes the Lee Enfield, the Mauser Nagant M91, boy that was an easy one, the Gewehr 98, the Lebel Model 1886, or the Model 1917. Now I know I'm going to get some brushback for that last one, but that's my opinion. Its cartridge is in no way inferior to the .303 British, the 7.62 by 54mm rim, the 8mm Mauser, or a 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. The only real knock on this rifle, in my opinion, was the original, delicate sport shooting style rear sight, something that the doughboys agreed with. That said, at the end of the day, the M1903 proved once again how incredible the Mauser style action really is. And the United States can be credited for being one of the few countries that actually committed to what was then a carbine length rifle. For me, it is a rifle that was both of its time and frankly a little ahead of it as well. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to at least be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope you have yourself a great day. Take care and bye-bye.